the specialties that we find in anatomy. So in order to understand anatomy, sometimes you have to do things and you may have to start at the beginning. And that is developmental biology. And we start out as two individual cells, an ovum and a sperm. They combine, they make one cell that would be a fertilized zygote or a fertilized ovum. From the zygote, that will divide into anywhere from 8 to 16 cells, and in that stage we refer to it as a morula. The morula will go through cavitation and form a blastocyst, and here's where you're seeing the early embryo really start to put out some cells. So I've already formed a blastocyst and I've already done some cavitation, but now I'm creating 3 germ layers and I'm having cells migrate out. And not only am I creating the embryo, which will go on to form the body, but I'm also creating the placenta. And this is a very complex series of cellular divisions and differentiation where you start out as one cell, but that cell divides and its progeny, the cells that result from that, change their genetic expression and become totally different cells, to the point you now have bone cells which are vastly different than the simple cuboidal cells that I showed you. And they all derive from the same cell. It's just how they're using the genetics that they inherited. So that's developmental biology, and we have an entire class on that. We will talk about some of the beginnings because it's a good thing to know where you came from. Comparative anatomy, that's where you dissect a cat and you think you know what a human looks like. I'm not a fan, but in other anatomy classes that you might take, you would dissect a cat. Here we just dissect people and the organs that are associated. Clinical, that would be speaking about anatomy in terms of different diseases or clinical aspects. We're not going to do that right now. We just need to focus on understanding the anatomy before we can apply it to a clinical setting. Surgical anatomy, that's basically very, very precise knowledge of knowing where everything is in relationship to another. Let's just hold off on that and get our feet on the ground with understanding who's next to whom. Radiographic anatomy is where you are doing x-rays, maybe CT scans or MRIs. We are not ready for that. Those pictures can be confusing in the way that they slice the body, and things may not look necessarily like what we're just starting to get used to. So we're going to hold off on talking too much about that. Cross-sectional anatomy is where you take and you do a CT scan and you slice the person into very small sections, and each section has a picture associated with it. It's extremely fascinating. It's very detailed, but it's not where we're at. But we will talk about the different planes that are used when we section the body. So you're going to have a horizontal or transverse plane that divides the body into halves up and down. When you use that plane, you then refer to things that are superior and inferior to one another. You are going to have a coronal plane, and the coronal plane is going to cut across. And as you do that, you're going to create a front side and a back side. So when you use that plane, we're going to be talking anterior and posterior. And then you have a sagittal plane. The sagittal plane cuts down dead center to the sagittal suture. And if it is the mid-sagittal plane or median plane, then essentially you have equal right and half sides of the body. And when you're using this plane, then you're looking at right and left, or one half versus the other. If I'm on the same side of the plane, then I am ipsilateral. If I am on opposite sides of the plane, then I am contralateral. So my lungs are contralateral to one another. I have my right lung over here and my left lung over here. And they're contralateral to one another because in order to get from one to the other, I have to cross my median plane. Now, you also have a whole bunch of parasagittal planes, so I could cut here, I could cut here, I could cut here, I could cut here. Parasagittal is anywhere, and you create a size difference in your left and right side. Now, why it's important to understand those is because those three are the core cardinal planes. Those are the ones that would create a three-dimensional map of the body. But sometimes you can't get to things in the body, or the body is not divided along planes that are at a 90-degree angle to one another. So you have to use an oblique plane. Now, oblique planes are nice in that they can divide the body irregularly to get to a subject that you're looking for, but when you do that, they can skewer the view that you might have. So if I'm looking at the intestine here, if I use an oblique plane and I cut like this, then all of a sudden what used to be a nice circular organ comes out very oblong. And so just be aware that when you're using oblique planes, because you're not at a 90-degree angle to the organ perhaps, then the picture you get is maybe not what you're expecting. So from the specialties and some of the things that we have to do to the body, we will go on to the different levels. So we've talked about this a little, and what we're going to do is now give you some photographic evidence for what's happening. We start out at the chemical area. We have atoms that come together. This molecule is created from three different atoms. We have 2 hydrogen and an oxygen. So the atoms or the elements come together to form molecules. The molecules might be relatively simple, like water, or they could be very complex, like fatty acids and proteins. From these chemicals, we build molecules that go into creating cellular level. And here we have our famous picture of the cell again, and we've already talked a little bit about the organelles inside of that. These cells then come together to form tissues. Now, when we talked about this before, I only showed you pictures of the epithelial tissue, but I did tell you that there are 4 tissues that make up every organ. So here they are. We have epithelial tissues that are always on the outside, and they always contain one cell that is juxtaposed to the next cell. So whenever you look at epithelial tissue, you're going to see one cell with no material between attached to another cell all along. This is on the surface because here is the lumen, or the inside of the tube or structure. And then I have my epithelial tissue that is right on the surface. Then here's my simple cuboidal again, but notice that I've created these internal surfaces, and the epithelial tissue is lining that surface. This is skin. I have lots and lots of cells attached to one another. This is the outside of the body where you're going to put the soap and water when you shower, but then you have the epithelial tissue here that is protecting you from the outside. And then again, another lumen. This is outside, this is inside, and then I have another stratified columnar that is forming that border. Now, connective tissues, I don't have a separate picture for them. I certainly could. I could show you a section of bone. Bone is a solid connective tissue. But most of the connective tissues that you might run across are actually right next to an epithelial tissue. So here's my epithelial tissue, here's connective tissue. Connective tissue has cells, but these cells are placed at a distance from one another, and I have a whole bunch of material, which could be fibers, or they could be gelatin, or basically just glue and goo that hold the fibers and the cells together. So anywhere I have an epithelial tissue, underlying that epithelial tissue is going to be a connective tissue. So here I have connective tissue, here's my epithelial, here's my connective tissue around. I don't have connective tissue here because the section doesn't show the entire depth of the skin. And then here I have a whole bunch of openings here, here, and here, but then between I've got connective tissue and these cells here that look like they might be spaces. If you had a higher magnification, you would see that they were fat cells. And fat is a nice, good connective tissue as well. Connective tissues always store something. Bones store minerals, fat stores energy. Muscle tissue is here. I have muscle cells that are attached to one another, but muscle cells are filled primarily by actin and myosin, which allow it to contract. So this is going to be skeletal muscle. You also have cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, but for right now, let's just use skeletal muscle as our example for muscle tissue. And then lastly, but not leastly, we have nervous tissue. Nervous tissue composed of neurons that are then surrounded by glial cells and housed in either a nerve, a ganglion, or your brain or spinal cord. And so this picture is showing a neuron, and you can see the nerve cell body, and coming off from the nerve cell body, you have the dendrites that are gathering information, and then down here you have the axon that's coming off that's going to carry the information to another part of the body. So those are the four tissues. From here, we will go to organs, creating organs from the four different types of tissue. And so when you think about organs, probably you're thinking about the stomach, the lungs, or in this instance, the heart. So there are many organs, and you take those organs and you connect them to one another so that they can function concurrently with each other. And when you do that, you create systems. Now there are 11 systems in the body, and I will just run through them without giving you all of the examples of the organs that go into them, but at least one. So integumentary system, this one might seem unfamiliar to you. This is basically your skin. And the skin is the organ that is primarily associated with the integumentary system. You also have some other accessory structures like sweat glands, oil glands, and hair. But if you're looking at the integumentary system, you're looking primarily at the skin. Muscular system, when we're using the muscles as a system, we're usually not talking about cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. Muscular system is looking at the skeletal muscles. Now, you have approximately 700 skeletal muscles in your muscular system. So if you're ever asked, just pick your favorite one to give an example. Probably you know about gluteus maximus, or you've heard about biceps brachii. So if you're asked for an example, just pick one of the 700 that you are pretty sure you know how to spell. Cardiovascular system. Cardio refers to the heart. Vascular refers to all the veins and the arteries that are attached to it. So probably at this point in your understanding, if you're asked for an example, you'll just say heart. You may know about the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava or the axillary artery, but usually when asked, people just say heart. They don't start naming veins and arteries. Endocrine system. You have 9 endocrine organs that produce all of the hormones that regulate your body. And so if you are asked to just give one of the endocrine glands, probably you've heard of the pineal gland, hypothalamus, and then thyroid, or any one of those will be appropriate examples for the endocrine system. Your respiratory system, that's going to be lungs primarily. And then you've got your reproductive systems. Just pick a testicle or an ovary or a uterus, penis. Skeletal system, you have about 207 bones in your body. Good news is that you're bilateral, and so you divide that in half, and you're looking at about 103 individual bones. that you'll name. At this point, you probably know at least one bone, so pick your favorite bone. Femur, rib, or ribs, something that belongs in the skeletal system. Lymphatic system, this is the system that is involved heavily in your immunity. It's also important in transporting materials around your body. Lymph nodes, spleen, those are good examples that are organs that are attached to the lymphatic system. Nervous system, this is anything that has nervous tissue in it. So primarily you're going to be looking at nerves. You can say brain, you can say spinal cord. But the ganglia and those attached structures are part of your nervous system. Digestive system, we are looking at all of the different organs that run from your mouth, the oral cavity, all the way to your anus, and they're attached to one another. So just pick one: stomach, esophagus, large intestine, small intestine. You have some accessory glands that are primarily digestive. That's going to be liver, pancreas. So those are all good examples for things that are within the digestive system. Urinary system, this is going to be your kidneys attached to the ureters, attached to the bladder, attached to the urethra. So just pick one of those. The bladder is a good common example. Now, usually when I ask for a representative organ of one system, you are not allowed to use them twice. So if you say reproductive system and you say penis, but then you go to urinary system and you say penis, well, that's not going to work. So pick a unique organ for each of the systems. There are many organs, you don't need to double dip.